The first time I heard about the morgue ghost, I was just starting my shift. It was an offhand comment passed between the night guard and one of the technicians as they swapped shifts. "You know about the 3 a.m. visitor, right?" the technician said, his voice a low murmur. I half listened, thinking it was just another one of those urban legends whispered around night shift circles. But as the weeks wore on, the stories grew more persistent and vivid. A shadowy figure, they said, with hollow eyes and skin stretched over bones like decayed leather. It would appear at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim flickering lights. Those who looked back found it staring, its gaze following them with a terrifying stillness. And always, it would get closer in the blink of an eye, just when they thought it hadn't moved. On the nights it showed itself, the scent of rotting flesh would hang in the air long after the figure disappeared. I shook it off as nonsense at first, hallucinations fueled by exhaustion. We all worked long hours in that place, surrounded by death and silence. But there were times, alone in the dimly lit corridors, that I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The building itself seemed to breathe, settling with strange groans that echoed through the empty halls. I started taking the long route to the office, avoiding the hallway where the figure was rumored to appear. One night, my curiosity got the better of me. I had just finished updating some records, and the clock read 2:50 a.m. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but part of me wanted to see if the stories held any truth. So I waited. The clock ticked toward 3. The second hand moving sluggishly, as if time itself were slowing down. My heart began to race, and I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. Just as the clock struck 3 a.m., the lights flickered. I told myself it was just a glitch, our wiring was ancient. But as the lights steadied, I caught a glimpse of something at the end of the hallway. A shadow. Tall, gaunt, barely visible, but unmistakably there. I couldn't make out its face, only the suggestion of hollowed eyes. The air grew cold, biting, and each breath felt like inhaling frost. I knew I should look away, but I couldn't move. It stared back, its empty gaze meeting mine. And then, without a sound, it moved closer. I blinked, and it was suddenly a few feet nearer, closer than before. My skin went cold, a tingling sensation creeping up my spine. The flickering light caught the details of its form, a face stretched tight over bones, hollow eyes staring, unblinking, into mine. I felt my breath hitch, and a faint whisper reached my ear. "Don't leave me here." I backed away, heart pounding, my skin prickling with fear. I couldn't bring myself to look away, terrified that if I did, it would get even closer. Then, with a surge of panic, I ran. The figure remained etched in my mind even as I turned the corner, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I didn't talk about what I'd seen. How could I? It sounded ridiculous, and besides, everyone knew the stories. They'd laugh it off, the way I had when I'd first heard them. But the haunting didn't end there. In the nights that followed, I noticed small things. A chill in the air, the faint scent of decay that clung to my clothes, a feeling of fingers brushing against my arm when no one was there. I started to dread going into work, my body tense with the expectation of seeing that shadowy figure again. And then, one night, I did. It was past 3 a.m., and I was alone, locking up for the night. The air was thick with silence, pressing down on me. I stepped into the hallway, and the lights flickered again. This time, I didn't want to look. I tried to keep my eyes straight ahead, telling myself that I wouldn't see it, that it was just a figment of my imagination. But as I walked, the temperature dropped, and a familiar, sickly sweet odor filled the hallway. "Don't leave me here." The whisper was louder this time, insistent. I froze, my hands shaking. Slowly, against every instinct, I turned. It was there, closer than ever, its arm outstretched, its decayed hand mere inches from my shoulder. Its eyes, dark, empty sockets, seemed to bore into me with a hunger, a desperation I couldn't comprehend. And as I stood there, paralyzed, it moved its hand toward my face. I felt the icy touch of its fingers graze my cheek, and I gasped, stumbling back. The sensation lingered, a searing cold that felt like it was etching into my skin. "Don't leave me here." The voice was pleading, filled with an unimaginable sorrow, and for a brief moment, I felt a wave of pity for the thing before me. But as I met its gaze, the pity was overtaken by a terror so deep I couldn't breathe. In a frantic haze, I bolted down the hallway, through the door, and out into the night air. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. I felt its touch lingering, an ice-cold imprint on my cheek that wouldn't fade. When I looked in the rearview mirror, a faint bruise was already forming where its fingers had brushed against my skin. I called in sick the next night, and the night after. But the bruise remained, darkening, spreading. Each night, I woke up gasping, my dreams filled with that pleading voice, that horrible skeletal face. Finally, I went back. I couldn't stay away. Some twisted part of me felt like I owed it to that thing, to understand what it wanted, why it had chosen me. The clock was nearing 3 a.m. when I found myself in that hallway again. The scent of decay was stronger than ever, and as the clock struck, the lights dimmed. This time I didn't run. The figure was waiting at the end of the hall, closer than before. Its hollow eyes met mine, and it reached out a decaying hand. I stepped forward, against every instinct, until our gazes locked, close enough that I could see every hollow, sunken curve of its face. "Don't leave me here," it whispered, the voice clearer than ever. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. It tilted its head, a faint, sad smile stretching its lips. "Don't you remember?" A wave of memories washed over me. Darkness, an unmarked grave, cold earth. I felt the world tilt as the realization hit me. This wasn't some spirit haunting me. It was me. The thing that stood before me was the part of myself I'd buried long ago, my own shadow, left behind in this place. And now it wanted to be whole again. As its hand touched mine, I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow, and then nothing. Only the cold silence of the morgue, empty and still. They found me the next morning, slumped in the hallway. The bruise had vanished, but I knew deep down that I'd never truly left that place. Part of me was still there, lingering in the dark, waiting for the next soul brave enough to look back. I'd heard the stories for years, the same way everyone in town did. The legend of the broken woman was a favorite among kids trying to scare each other and adults whispering over drinks. They said she haunted the dense forest just outside of town, appearing to those who strayed too far from the main paths. Skeletal, twisted, with limbs that seemed to have been broken and badly set so many times, she walked in spasms, her body jerking as if bound by invisible strings. But it was her face that haunted people the most. Eyes wide with a terror that seemed to beg for help, her mouth stretched open in a silent, eternal scream. No one knew who she was or why she haunted those woods, and I'd never met anyone who claimed to have seen her firsthand. But curiosity has a strange way of creeping up on you. On the night I decided to find out if the stories were true, I was feeling reckless. Maybe a little stupid. The week had been hellish, and I'd convinced myself that a night in the forest, even if only to debunk some town myth, would take my mind off things. It was a little after midnight when I set out, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows against the trees. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something. I walked along the main trail, following the narrow, winding path that eventually disappeared into a thicket, and then, without meaning to, I strayed. I didn't even realize it at first. One moment I was stepping over tree roots, the path still in sight, and the next I was staring into a maze of dark trees. There was no moonlight, no sounds, just an overwhelming, oppressive darkness pressing down around me. I turned back, but everything looked the same, the path lost to a labyrinth of twisted branches and shadows. A chill crawled up my spine, but I pushed forward, hoping to find a landmark. Anything to orient myself. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, giving it a firm shake. The light sputtered back to life just as I heard it, the faintest sound of crunching leaves, as though someone was shifting their weight in the distance. "Hello?" I called, feeling the absurdity of my voice breaking the silence. No response, but the sound continued, soft, steady, growing louder, closer. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, and I felt the air grow colder. The stories flooded back, each one sharper and clearer, whispering warnings I'd dismissed so easily just hours before. Then my flashlight dimmed again, and I caught the barest hint of movement from the corner of my eye. I whipped around, the beam illuminating nothing. Just trees and the eerie stillness that seemed to thicken the air. But as I turned back, she was there, inches from my face. I stumbled back, choking on a scream. the flashlight falling from my hand and spinning to illuminate her in broken flashes. She was exactly as they'd described, thin, almost skeletal, her limbs grotesquely angled, as if they'd been shattered and pieced back together by someone who didn't know how bones worked. Her head jerked, a marionette forced into motion, and her eyes locked onto mine, wide, hollow, and filled with a pleading, soul-wrenching terror. She didn't move, not at first. Her mouth stretched into that awful silent scream, lips trembling as if she were trying to speak but couldn't. And then, with a lurch that made my blood turn to ice, she moved closer, her twisted hand reaching out, blackened fingers curled as if desperate to touch, to cling. "Please," I heard myself whisper, as if I were the one begging for mercy. But the sound of my voice seemed to trigger something in her, a snap that sent her into a shuddering convulsion, her face twisted, eyes rolling back, and her mouth opened wider than any human mouth could. It was a yawning, empty void, black as night, a dark chasm where her tongue and teeth should have been. I took a step back, desperate to escape, but my foot caught on a root, and I crashed to the ground. She hovered above me, her broken body casting an unnatural shadow over mine, and I felt the bite of cold air as her hand brushed my cheek. Her skin was like ice, and her touch lingered, trailing down my face to my throat. I could feel her fingers tightening, pressing against my skin, leaving a cold imprint that felt as if it were sinking into my bones. I wanted to scream, to beg, but my voice wouldn't come. Then, as suddenly as she'd appeared, her grip slackened, her face shifting back to that pleading expression. Her eyes bored into mine, filled with an agony so profound that it felt as though it were seeping into me, mingling with my own fears. I felt her need, her desperation, and with a jolt I understood. She was asking for help. I wanted to ask her who she was, what had happened to her, but no words came. Instead, she leaned in closer, her mouth stretching wide, and I saw the darkness within it swirl, as though it were alive, a writhing blackness that called to me. And then, to my horror, I felt myself leaning toward her, drawn by something beyond my control, my face inches from that abyss. But just before my lips touched that endless darkness, she recoiled, her expression twisting in agony. A gurgling sound, like a drowning sob, escaped her, and she clutched her head, her body convulsing violently. I crawled backward, too terrified to stand, and she lurched away from me, her mouth stretched wide as if in a voiceless scream of rage or despair. Her eyes never left mine as she retreated, her body contorting, bending, until she was little more than a shadow against the trees. And then she was gone, vanished into the depths of the forest, leaving me alone in the cold, empty silence. I stumbled back to the path, heart racing, and ran until I was out of the woods, not daring to look back. But even as I reached the edge of town, the memory of her stayed with me, the ice-cold touch, the empty, pleading gaze, and that terrible void where her voice should have been. I don't go near the forest anymore, but it doesn't matter. I see her in my dreams, her twisted form reaching for me, her empty mouth stretching wider, that silent scream echoing in my mind. And sometimes in the dead of night, I feel her icy fingers brushing against my skin, as though she's still searching, still begging for the help I couldn't give. But the worst part? When I look in the mirror, I've started to see it. The faintest shadow behind me, her hollow eyes, her mouth stretching open in that silent, desperate scream. And in the depths of that darkness, I hear her whisper, a faint voice breaking through the silence at last, as she asks, "Why did you leave me there?" The lake had always been a source of fascination for me. In the daylight, it was a serene, glassy expanse that seemed almost magical. Families picnicked along the shore, couples strolled hand in hand, and kids splashed around in the shallows. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky bled into shades of indigo, the lake took on a different character altogether. Locals called it Nara's Lake, but never after dark. When the last traces of sunlight left the sky, they wouldn't even utter its name. Everyone knew the stories, yet no one talked about them. It was a silent pact among the townsfolk. Never go to the lake at night. They'd tell outsiders with a polite chuckle that it was just one of those local legends. But even in daylight, there was a nervousness when it came up. People said that if you stood by the water's edge, you might see her, the drowned maiden, as they called her. just beneath the lake's surface. I'd heard it all before. The tale passed from kid to kid growing up, always ending with a breathless warning. Never look into her eyes. They'd say that if you lingered too long, she'd snap her gaze to yours, her mouth twisting into a silent scream. And if you looked back, it would be the last thing you ever did. Curiosity has always been a flaw of mine. As much as I brushed off the stories, some part of me wanted to see if there was any truth to them. So one night, I decided to go to the lake alone. I told myself it was just to prove a point, to laugh in the face of superstition and fear. But as I parked my car at the edge of the darkened woods, a nagging unease twisted in my gut. The air was cold, and an unnatural stillness hung over the water. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence so thick it felt like it might swallow me whole. I walked to the edge of the lake, feeling the wet earth give slightly beneath my shoes. The lake stretched before me like a dark, motionless mirror. I stood there for a moment, squinting into the murky depths, expecting to see nothing but my own faint reflection. But then, just below the surface, I caught a flash of something pale. I held my breath, convinced it was a trick of the moonlight, some driftwood or a glimmer of light against the water. But then, she drifted closer. I saw her face first, just inches below the surface, her eyes wide open and staring. She was young, maybe no older than 20, though her skin was an unnatural shade, drained of all color. Her lips were pulled back in an eerie, stretched grin that sent a jolt of fear straight to my spine. Her hair floated around her head, dark tendrils spreading out in the water like the arms of some terrible creature. My heart pounded, and every instinct screamed for me to look away, to run back to my car. But I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. My gaze was locked on hers. Her face was frozen in a look of terror and agony, as if what had happened to her had left her in a permanent state of horror. And then her eyes snapped to meet mine. It was so sudden, I stumbled back, heart hammering. But I couldn't tear my gaze away. Her eyes were hollow, filled with a despair so deep, it felt like it was reaching out to pull me under. I saw her mouth move, the stretched grin fading as her lips parted, and she began to whisper, bubbles drifting from her mouth to the surface of the water. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound crawled up my spine, a soft, gurgling murmur that seemed to echo inside my head. Her hand drifted up from beneath the water, fingers pale and thin, reaching toward me, her mouth moving faster, more frantic. The whispers grew louder, the gurgling sound shifting into something desperate, pleading. Her other hand rose, grasping at the surface as if she were clawing her way out, her eyes never leaving mine. And then, in a voice that was barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears, I heard her whisper, "Help me." The words were faint but clear, and I felt a pull. Something deep within me urging me forward, to reach out and take her hand, to bring her back to the surface. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was the desperation in her eyes, or the mournful look that seemed to beg for release. I found myself kneeling by the water's edge, reaching out, my hand hovering inches above the surface. Her fingers inched closer, just brushing mine, and the instant our skin touched, a searing cold shot through my body. It was like being plunged into icy water, my breath freezing in my chest. I tried to pull back, but her grip tightened, her fingers digging into my wrist with an unnatural strength. Her mouth opened wider, the sound of her whispers turning into a choked, gurgling scream, and in that moment, I saw it. The last moments of her life, a memory that flashed through my mind like a nightmare. She'd been dragged under, her legs tangled in thick weeds, water filling her lungs as she clawed at the surface, desperate for air. I could feel her terror, her panic, the realization that no one would hear her, that she would die alone, sinking into the darkness. The vision shattered, and I was back by the lake, her face inches from mine, her mouth twisted into that horrible grin again. But now, her eyes were empty, void of the pleading sorrow that had drawn me in. And then she pulled. My fingers slipped beneath the water, her cold grasp dragging me closer, and I felt the water lap against my wrist, icy and suffocating. I struggled, panic flooding my veins, but her grip was unyielding, her expression shifting from terror to something darker, a twisted satisfaction, as though she'd finally found what she was looking for. With a burst of strength, I yanked my hand free, stumbling back onto the shore, gasping for air. My wrist was numb, the skin pale and blue where her fingers had gripped me, the icy chill lingering long after she'd released me. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back as I ran to my car. My heart hammered as I threw myself inside, locking the doors, my eyes darting to the lake. She was gone, the water still and empty, as if nothing had happened. But I could feel her presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for someone else to come close enough to reach. When I got home, I tried to wash away the numbness in my wrist, but the feeling didn't fade. In the days that followed, a strange bruise appeared, a pattern that looked like slender fingers clinging to my skin like a permanent mark. And at night, I dreamt of her, drifting just beneath the surface, her hand reaching out, her hollow eyes watching me, always watching. Her voice echoed in my head, a faint whisper that grew louder each time I closed my eyes. "Help me." But there was no sorrow in her eyes anymore, no plea for release, only an endless, insatiable hunger, as though she were waiting, biding her time. And as the days passed, I felt myself drawn back to the lake, a pull I couldn't resist, as if her cold fingers were still wrapped around my wrist, guiding me. I know it's only a matter of time before I return. Her memory lingers in my mind, a shadow that I can't shake. And in my dreams, I see myself standing by the lake's edge, my reflection rippling as her hand breaks the surface, reaching out. One night, I know I'll give in to that pull. And when I do, I know she'll be waiting, her fingers reaching, her mouth moving in that silent, endless whisper, and her cold, grasping hands pulling me under until the lake is silent once again.